Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2.
No, I'll remember to take it off. That's what you mean, right?
Yes. So we're recording this?
Yeah, no, I got it. No, I'll make sure I do that. But you'll come up to it too, right? To remind me.
I did. I tried to find it.
No, I
sit here, or what should I do?
Sure, if you like. And then, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. The star of the show has arrived. We're looking forward to hearing from Sam. I'm Darren Dochuk, and I am a faculty member here in the Department of History, and with my colleague, David Lantigua, I co-direct the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. I want to thank you all for joining us today, especially those who may be attending a Cushwa Center event for the first time. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging this event's co-sponsors. You see the banners here. Notre Dame Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, the Notre Dame Democracy Initiative, the Program on Church, State, and Society, and the Rooney Democracy Institute, all here at Notre Dame. Thank you. We're grateful to these partners for their support and collaboration leading up to today, the signature event, the evening talk by Sam, but we did have earlier events, one, of course, over lunch with many affiliates of these different institutes, and had a chance to talk with Sam about his book. And there's much to talk about, as you can see. It's a big book. Special thanks also to Shane Albrick and Madonna Noak, Cushwa Center stalwarts, for all the time and effort they committed to organizing this event. We are fortunate to welcome Sam Tanenhaus as our speaker. Sam is an acclaimed journalist, historian, and biographer. The former editor-in-chief of the New York Times Book Review, he has also been a contributing editor and writer for Vanity Fair. His feature articles and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and many other outlets. I will say he's been on many podcasts too. Maybe he can talk a bit about that. This past fall, he was the Zubro Distinguished Visiting Journalist at Cornell University. He has also been a visiting professor at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In short, as we heard today at lunch, he's one of the most sought-after interpreters of American political life, and we're really fortunate to have him with us for this evening's conversation. Sam's books include the bestsellers, Whittaker Chambers, a biography, 1997, and The Death of Conservatism, which was published in 2009. His biography of Chambers won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was shortlisted for both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer. Sam's latest biographical work is the result of years of research and writing, beginning back at least in 1998. That year, William F. Buckley himself chose Sam to tell the authoritative story of his life and times. He granted Sam extensive interviews and exclusive access to his private papers, thus launching a deep investigation into the complicated world of modern conservatism's charismatic founder. The much anticipated result, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America, was published in June 2025. In November, it was included in the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2025. Since it has been published, as we mentioned, Sam has been speaking about this book in a wide range of distinguished venues, and it is a privilege to welcome him to Notre Dame for the first time. Today, Sam will take up a topic that is well suited to Notre Dame, of course, including the question of whether and how Catholicism and Catholic interlocutors influenced Buckley personally and politically, and what that tells us about modern American religion and politics. Just a brief note on the order of events. Sam will come and speak with us for 30, 35 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. Sam is eager to engage you, so please jot down your questions, and we'll do our best to make time for them. Then, after the question and answer is over, we'll have refreshments, and Sam is going to be here ready to sign books as well, all right? Sam, thank you.
I don't know for how many years I've been lowering microphones. Thank you, Darren. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is the first time I've set foot on Notre Dame campus, and I lived in Iowa for much of my life. And I just assumed this would be like the size of the University of Texas in Austin, that it would be 50,000 students and miles of campus. In fact, it's almost somewhat closer to my own college, Grinnell, where I went, although bigger than that, but it has the same intimate feel. So it's really great to be here, and I've had a chance to see the Basilica and the Grotto and the Golden Dome, and it's really been a pleasure, and it's so nice to see so many of you here. Bill Buckley and Catholicism. First, I don't want anyone to think there's some false intimacy in my calling William F. Buckley Jr. Bill, because everyone called him that, including the male clerks at his magazine, National Review. That was just the kind of informality and egalitarianism that he created with the people around him. It's one of the paradoxes of modern politics. Someone who first pointed this out was Peggy Noonan when she wrote her book on Reagan, President Reagan, how at ease conservatives often were with just the people they encountered day to day, and liberals who were the great supporters of the common people would be very standoffish and aloof. And it's somewhat of an exaggeration, but only somewhat. Because there's a reason for Bill Buckley to have been so open and egalitarian. The man was building a movement that really didn't exist before he got there. And that meant to be open to all comers, to seek people out. When I first started as a nonfiction writer a long time ago, in 1989, when I signed the contract for this book, I'd done a little work beforehand. I was very excited when I got the contract to do the Whittaker Chambers biography. That was my first big book. And I sent notes around, and in my naivete, I thought, well, now the editors of these journals I read and admire, like the New York Review of Books and the New Republic, will let me write for them. I never heard from any of them. Who got in touch with me? Commentary Magazine, the New Criterion, the American Scholar, then edited by Joseph Epstein, and in those days, no one knew what my politics were. I don't know what my politics are. I was not a subscriber to National Review, but the literary establishment of that time was waiting to see if I was somehow culturally or socially acceptable before I would be included among them. When I wrote to Mr. Buckley in 1990, and for the younger people in the room, there's some older ones who'll remember, in those days you typed a letter and you put it in an envelope and stuck it in the mail and hoped you'd get a reply. Bill Buckley was one of the first to express interest in the biography I was writing of Whittaker Chambers. Didn't ask me anything about myself, what my ideology was, what my politics were. He wanted to know what books I liked, what sort of reading I did. He thought I was a good writer or could become one. He was a very close reader of people's prose. The publisher of National Review, William Rusher, once said that, thank God the Communist Manifesto wasn't better written, or we would have lost Bill Buckley, because good writing mattered to him. All he cared about was a book that would tell the story well. And I think that's why he liked the idea of my writing his biography. And just to clarify, because there seems to be some confusion, I was not anointed by him to do it. It really grew out of conversations I had first with his son, Christopher Buckley, the wonderful novelist and humorist, and then with Bill Buckley himself. And we talked about it, what he wanted in a book, not in an explicit way, but in almost a kind of atmospheric way. What he liked about the Chambers biography was that it was about an era, and you saw Chambers from different sides. And that's what Bill Buckley wanted, because he was so big a figure that people who encountered him thought they knew all of him when they were seeing only a part of him. And so a biographer who could capture him in motion and place him in history is, I think, what he was looking for. When he might have chosen any number of writers who were better versed in the ideology and philosophy, including of Catholicism. So let's get to that. It's one reason it's fun to talk to this audience, and I want to show you something. Darren was very generous about the lunch we had. This is after the questions I got, this is the first time I've come back with notes. I had homework to do after the questions that were asked of me today. And so I've been thinking about this and how best to approach it. One reason it's fun to talk about Catholicism is because the main influence on Buckley's life was his mother, not his father. We hear a great deal about the famous oil man, William F. Buckley Sr., who was an extraordinary figure. When the great Irish writer, fiction writer, and critic John Banville surprised me by reviewing the Buckley book, did it in the Times of London. I had no idea he was doing this, but then I saw the review, and he liked the book a lot. He liked the storytelling and the writing and all those things. And then a friend of mine who'd also written a review of the book got, in the New York Review of Books, got a note from Banville saying, well, I'd rather read about the father than the son. And that writer, Mark Lilla, forwarded the note to me, started a correspondence with Banville, and I told him, you're right, the father in some ways is more interesting than the son. But now I get to talk about his mother, because she was the absolute embodiment of Catholic faith and created the example Bill Buckley grew up with. And that's important because he was surrounded by and knew the great Catholic intellectuals of his time. But his own faith was very personal. It was personal, and it came out of his days in the church. He was an altar boy in the Catholic Church in Sharon, Connecticut, where he grew up. And to understand being a Buckley, a Catholic in what's called the northwest corner of Connecticut, which is that little bit, if you're familiar with the state, that's just south of the Berkshires in Massachusetts and just across the border from Dutchess County, New York. So it's kind of high, old, WASP, Yankee America. Buckley's father was from South Texas. His mother was from New Orleans, and they raised their children in this preserve, this Yankee preserve. So sometimes I tell audiences when we're talking about politics that the Buckleys were all raised to hate Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, but they also saw him every summer at the Rhinebeck Horse Show. It's a different world. It's an enclosed world, but it was also closed against them. And the reason you write books like mine, look, there are very serious scholars here. I see, for instance, I think the very renowned Professor Deneen here. They know ideas and arguments. I just kind of muddle my way through. So I do the personal thing. What was it like to grow up as Bill Buckley? Well, one thing you see is when you go to Main Street in Sharon, Connecticut, where he grew up, there's this wonderful long green. Connecticut towns are proud of their green, sometimes called commons in Massachusetts. In Connecticut, it's always the green. And the Buckley's beautiful home, which still stands, though it's been broken up into condominiums, is on one side of the green, and on the other are the two oldest churches in town. So now I'll do a little quizzing. Anybody know in a Connecticut town what the very first church, what denomination it always is? Yeah, it's always Congregational Church, right? Yeah, of course you did. And it's funny because I'm writing something now and I realize how little I know and how little most people know about religion in America. That if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look up the word democracy, most of the references are to the early church because it was a rebellion against the Church of England. So the Congregational Church is on the other side of Main Street. And next to it is the beautiful Episcopal Church, Christ Church. And then if you go down the street, you're still on Main Street, you get to the somewhat lower church, Methodist Church. But then if you turn down a corner and go to a back alley, you see a church called St. Bernard's. That's where the Catholics worshiped. It was built in 1930 because they finally realized there were enough Catholics in the area to support a parish. And who were the other Catholics apart from the Buckleys? Half of them worked for the Buckley family. There were grooms or house servants. This is the Depression. And Fortune magazine told people if you're well off, the best way you can help your fellow citizens is to hire them for $8 a week or whatever they pay. Farmers in the area, people who had worked in the mines, the iron mines, it was called the Iron Range there in Connecticut. And that's who surrounded Buckley at church, where he was an altar boy. His brothers were altar boys. Two of his sisters were married in that church, and that's where the final commemoration and funeral for Bill Buckley was, in that tiny church, St. Bernard's. And it's an eye-opener because you see how the place Catholicism had in American life back then. His mother, the New Orleans belle, was not welcome in the home of her neighbors because they sent the calling card to the house with one corner turned down. That means you don't need to bother to come to my home. That's why they bought a second home in Camden, South Carolina for the winters. The mother was very lonely where her children were gone. And Catholic women of a certain generation will get this. She had 11 children. One of them died at just her first days of birth. And she had the first one, Aloise Steiner Buckley, her name was. She was Swiss and German, in 1918, and the last in 1938, and there was not much breathing room in between. It was almost a continual cycle of childbirth, raising, and then recovering as she got older from surgery. She almost died on the doctor's table twice. But she was in the household, the embodiment of Catholicism, a daily communicant. Nice to talk to an audience where people know what that means. When I did a firing line interview with Margaret Hoover, I mentioned this. I said, shouldn't I say what a daily communicant is? She said, no, everybody will understand. Oh, really? Okay, I hope she's right. And one of her daughters said she prayed for everything. She prayed that the souffle would hold. She prayed for the baby's cough. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Well, that's why you write books like this. Her own family, she was the eldest daughter in the second family, Aloise, that her father, Aloysius Steiner, had in New Orleans, because the first family, his wife and 3 children, all died for a typhus epidemic. Right, New Orleans, famous, notorious for this, early 1900s. This is before the influenza, 1914 and before. They all died. And so faith and hope is what got her through her experience. She regretted that Buckley's sisters, only one of there were 6 girls and their siblings, the ones who survived, 6 girls, 4 boys. 5 of the 6 girls went to secular schools. Only one of the daughters went to a convent school. It's an interesting contrast with the Kennedys, because the Kennedy daughters all went to convent colleges. Only one Buckley daughter didn't. Think, well, why was that? Well, the reason is the mother wanted them to go there. And I saw correspondence when there were some pranks and incidents. The Buckley children liked to play pranks when they were growing up in their small town, is she thought they had not gotten enough religion in school because they did not receive religious instruction. This is really important to keep in mind about Buckley. His great parallel figure, they emerged as really famous men at about the same moment, was John F. Kennedy, who was a little bit older than Bill. Bill was almost exactly the same age as Robert Kennedy. And the great matriarch Rose Kennedy referred to Bill Buckley and Bobby Kennedy as twins. They were born 4 days apart in 1925. John F. Kennedy had almost no religious training. He spent 1 year in a Catholic school. That's exactly how much time Bill Buckley spent. He had 1 year in a school called St. John's, Beaumont in England during World War II. His father sent him and two of his sisters to England to be educated. Just for a year, when war broke out, he brought them home. It was the only religious education Buckley got outside of the church. The rest of it came from the brilliant people he gathered around him. And this came up at lunch when we were talking about, I was asked about the intellectual influences. Now, whom did Buckley read? Well, Buckley, he liked Catholic writers. He liked Evelyn Waugh. He liked G.K. Chesterton, both converts, by the way. A lot of the people, the editors at National Review, though it was thought of, the magazine he started in 1955, it was thought of as a Catholic magazine. It was not. There were only two Catholics on staff. And when his protege, his disciple, and later apostate, as Bill called him, Gary Wills, wrote a book, an early book about Catholicism in National Review, he had to go to elaborate lengths to explain, because of a controversy that had arisen, that no, National Review is not officially a Catholic magazine. The reason people thought it was, we have a simple word for that, begins with B, it's called bigotry, which Buckley first experienced growing up. I told you a little bit about it, but where he next encountered it was at Yale. So some people will know will know Bill Buckley's first book, God and Man at Yale. And it is in some ways the most important thing he wrote. It was had the greatest influence on the formation of the conservative movement. It created a blueprint for the protests going on in college campuses now. What Buckley did was it sounds like a very boring and dry topic, but he was so gifted a writer, he made it fun to read. He just discussed the curriculum at Yale. And he said, why is it that a university founded by Protestants to teach churchmen, clergymen in 1701, and we're still doing that in 1901, is suddenly filled with new dealers and atheists 50 years later? That's what the book is about. And he said, he didn't say they shouldn't be allowed to do it. What he said was, why doesn't anybody admit this is what's going on? So the genius of God and Man at Yale is in its subtitle, which is The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. And academic freedom is in quotes. That is Buckley, the genius writer. What does he do? He takes the thing that the liberal elites of his era prided themselves on most, their free-thinking, Enlightenment view of the world, and he calls it a superstition, which is exactly what they think his Catholicism is. So he turns it on them. And it grew out of a single lecture he'd had when he was either a freshman or sophomore that he wrote about in his first big editorial as the editor of the Yale Daily News. Bill Buckley was, I think, I've written a lot about journalists. I'm a journalist myself, kind of accidentally became one. I think he was the greatest campus journalist in American history. His editorials in the Yale Daily News, he wrote one each day, were read by Catholic clergy. They were read by professors here because of the arguments he made, pointing out that atheism dominated the culture, even in religion departments. When I did one of the first podcasts, Darren's mentioned I've done a lot of podcasts. One of the very first ones was with Andrew Sullivan. Some of you may know the Catholic, Irish, now American writer. And he said to me, and he's younger than I am. He went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. He raised in England and came here. You know, it's a crisscrossing thing. And went to Harvard in the 1980s. And he said he was shocked when he took religion courses that there wasn't one professor who indicated there might actually be some truth in the Bible. It was read strictly as a literary text. And if it was surprising to Andrew Sullivan in the 1980s, you can imagine how that registered with Bill Buckley in 1949 when he wrote his editorial. The editorial created a scandal on campus. There was a rule you could write critically about the university and about practices, but you shouldn't name names. And Buckley identified the professor he objected to, who was a very popular sociology professor who was also interested in anthropology and talked about cultural relativism and churches. And Buckley was offended by that. He made a joke about the Eucharist. Well, I did some reading from that period, and one of the Catholic fiction writers I admire most, novelist Flannery O'Connor, a lot of people here probably know her. She said, she was Buckley's exact contemporary, born in 1925, just like him. And she describes in one of her letters going to a dinner party in Manhattan with a lot of literary people. And one of them says to her, "You don't take the Eucharist seriously, do you?" And she says, "If I don't take the Eucharist seriously, I'm not a Catholic." Like, why wouldn't I? It begins with that, right? And this is what Buckley thought. It's what a lot of people thought. Here's something that surprised me. Darren mentioned that I got Buckley's private papers. One of them is a scrapbook. He was so successful at Yale. If you know the book Stover at Yale, Buckley was like a later version of that. He was Mr. Everything, edited the campus newspaper. The last man tapped for Skull and Bones, which is the highest accolade. It's like when you do a top 10 list and number one comes last. So to be the last man tapped for Skull and Bones, a public event in those days, public humiliation event. He would speak to alumni groups to raise money for the college. He was a sensation. He was a star. And when he wrote that, so he kept a scrapbook. When he wrote that first editorial, he got letters from secular professors of philosophy at Yale who told him he was right. That it's one thing for a professor to raise a question and to ask a challenging question about any religion, including Catholicism. It's another thing to make a joke about it just to get laughs from your students when you know there are believing Catholics in the room, right? This is one of the things that's happening on campuses now that we're thinking through. Buckley had the antennae to pick that up and to know, even if it didn't bother his classmates, who's it going to bother? Their parents and the donors to the university. So he puts his book together, writes it in about 2 months, which is about as much time as Buckley ever spent on a book. He would write his spy novels in 8 to 10 days. And he was just a very fast writer because he hated writing. And there are two things you do when you hate writing. Either you don't do it at all, or you just get it out of the way. So he would get it out of the way. But he's a gifted writer, too. And so he circulated the manuscript to some of his advisors and friends. And they said, "Bill, you have an ingenious book here. You're really showing all the hypocrisy and unacknowledged orthodoxy at Yale." Because as Buckley argued, well, get up in front of that class and make a joke about how people who don't believe in segregation are dumb. He said, "What would happen what if you went up in front of a class or gave a lecture on Yale and you were a white supremacist?" He said this in 1949. How would they treat you then? He said, "My guess is before the next full moon, you'd be off that campus." In other words, there were standards and ideas and limits that were prescribed, only they applied to certain areas and certain people, right? So this is the argument you'll see Chris Rufo or Barry Weiss make. They're essentially taking that same argument. It's not just about whether you agree with something, it's about what's allowed to be said, right? And Buckley found the fault lines where he was saying things he wasn't supposed to. Well, when I go through the album, not only do I see that there were secular professors of philosophy, including one of his favorites, the first tenured Jewish faculty member at Yale, Paul Weiss, famous philosopher, said to Buckley, "You're right. Somebody should be writing like that. No one should be teaching students in that way." All right? Then, when the book came out, Yale mounted a campaign to try to expose and undermine Buckley. How did they do it? There was a change in presidents at the university. The new president, Whitney Griswold, which is about as classic a Connecticut name, right, as you can have, found another brilliant young Yale man who is now teaching at Harvard, McGeorge Bundy. Remember him? Yeah, he's one of the geniuses who gave us the Vietnam War. Bundy was commissioned to review the book by the Atlantic Monthly, and he called Buckley a twisted and ignorant young man who, because he is enthralled to the Vatican, doesn't understand the Protestantism of Yale, right? So this is the great, free-thinking university coming after Buckley. Buckley found out only at the end of his time at the college, was that there was a quota on Catholics there. Some of you probably know that. Catholics and Jews, there was a quota. There were so few students of color, they didn't even have to bother excluding them, but 13% Jews and 13% Catholics is what were admitted. And Jewish students were grouped together in dorms because they would be more comfortable, right, is the argument. So Buckley is discovering all this about Yale, and then I saw the letters that came in from alumni. This is a long book. You can see it in some of the notes I have, where Jewish graduates, Jewish alumni are saying to the president, so does this mean we're supposed to sound like Protestants too? And others are saying to Griswold, why are you smearing him as this agent of the Vatican? Do you know how often Catholicism is mentioned in God and Man at Yale? It's not. His definition of Christianity came from a lecture that Reinhold Niebuhr gave on the Yale campus. It's really a case for Christianity. And that was the confusion that came up over and over again. When National Review was called a Catholic magazine, Buckley would say, no, it's a Christian magazine. Because as we know, the distinctions are, they may seem very important if you belong to one denomination or another, but theologically, they're not necessarily that great, particularly Episcopalians and Catholics. But that put Buckley on the map, and what it made him see, that first book, published in 1951, became a bestseller, amazingly, got onto the New York Times bestseller list for 1 week, got onto some others as well, is he made the discovery that the war, the battle that was going to be waged in American politics was going to be waged as a cultural battle. And sometimes I'm asked what I mean by that. They think I'm talking about particular issues, wedge issues as they later came to be called, abortion or reproductive rights or sexuality, transgender sexuality. No, what it means is it's a political battle, but you're not going to wage it in Congress. Congress people are going to do whatever they do, but you're going to try to mold minds earlier on. That's what he meant by that. That's what he discovered. That's why Buckley would always go to college campuses and came here. Before I run out of time, I will mention his magnificent oration on this campus, which is a very important piece in my book and the story I tell. But I want to mention a couple of things first. Is Buckley had a really early confrontation with the Vatican when Pope John the 23rd issued, it was not his first encyclical, but his second. Someone mentioned it today. It was called Mater et Magistra, right? Church and Mother and Teacher. And it was a plea to capitalist countries in the West to treat their own working class more generously through profit-sharing programs or to have a minimum wage. And Buckley said, that's fine, but you kind of left out the other bad guys, the communists. They don't have anything to say about them. Their human dignity, their treatment, people. I was only able to include a small piece of that discussion, that controversy in the book, but so I gave the actual chapter of it to Commonweal magazine, which published a good bit of it. And it puts it in the context of the time. This was 1961. And the great hemispheric threat to Catholics was coming in Cuba from Fidel Castro. For those of you who are familiar with that early history, they actually imprisoned clergy, shipped them out of the country to Spain, and the Vatican did nothing about it because they wanted to try to, compromise, do some kind of negotiation. And Buckley was enraged by that and wrote about it. And that's what he came under attack for. It was just for a few words in an editorial he wrote, National Review. Like a lot of magazines in those days, and some today, it had at the beginning of the book, as they call it, unsigned editorials. And I got to see who signed them all because I had access to the original versions of all the articles he wrote. And the phrase Buckley used to describe the encyclical, Mater et Magistra, was a venture in triviality, he called it, which is kind of classic Buckley. It's not blasphemous, it's not heretical, he's kind of needling him. But there was a furor And I saw letters from neighbors, from friends, from priests in Brooklyn. Cancel my subscription. How dare you speak that way about the church? We are all supposed to obey the church. And so his brilliant protege, Gary Wills, put together a defense for Buckley. It's a book called Politics and Catholic Freedom. Does anybody know this? You probably know. From 1964. The title is a reply to a book by kind of a muckraking journalist called Paul Blanchard. Wrote a book called, I wrote it down because I always forget it. It's called American Freedom and Catholic Power. That was one of the texts used to attack Buckley's God-Man at Yale. He was essentially accused of being an agent of the Vatican early on. And Blanchard in this book wrote, yeah, there's a conspiracy in America. This is the McCarthy era. He says, yeah, there's a conspiracy in America, but it's not the communists, it's the Catholics, because they all answer to the Vatican. Well, then a Catholic came along that they liked, John F. Kennedy. So Blanchard wrote another book. This shows you Bill Buckley's influence. Anybody know the name of the second book Blanchard wrote? It's called God and Man in Washington. And he says, well, we don't have to worry about the Catholics anymore. Why not? Buckley wrote a letter to the New York Times explaining why. Yeah, because this new guy sounds like a Protestant. That's why. It sounds like he's an enemy of the church. That's why you like him so much. And so Gary Wills wrote two famous books that really begin with that controversy. The first is the one I mentioned, Politics and Catholic Freedom. That is very scholarly. Buckley asked him to write it. He said, there are all these attacks on me. No one understood what I said. Because Wills had kind of explained to him at the time, papal encyclicals are important, but they're not the final word. They're letters to the flock. They represent evolving thoughts, so you don't have to give it too much weight, either in agreeing or not agreeing with it. These are the kind of issues they would debate at National Review. And Buckley said, well, why don't you write a book about it? So if you're familiar with Gary Wills' writing, what does he do? He immerses himself in the entire history of papal encyclicals and wrote the first book ever about it. Drawing on Latin sources, on French sources, Italian. He reads through the entire literature, and it began with Buckley's book. And Buckley said, you know what, you're a genius. This is a fantastic book, but what about me? He's got him in there, but he doesn't make the case for him. So then Wills wrote a second book. Some of you may know it. It's one of my favorite titles of all American nonfiction books. It's called Bare Ruined Choirs. It's about the crisis of liberalism in the Catholic Church. So for those of you who are familiar with Gary Wills, who's still alive, and a friend of mine, he turns 92 in May, and you think of him very much as a kind of left-wing critic of the church, and he sounds more hostile to the church sometimes than people who've never been Catholics. Well, he was someone who was ordained, was studying to be a priest, had to have released from his orders by the Vatican. And he was Buckley's tutor in Catholicism. So when Buckley had debates, Wills would sit him down and walk him through the scripture. He was an absolutely devout Catholic, and always said, even when he disagreed with Buckley, said, Bill Buckley is the most pure, devout Catholic you will ever meet. And he described for me a wedding where where Wills himself was getting married. And it was in Connecticut. It was in Wallingford, Connecticut, where his wife, Natalie, was from. And Wills is young, late 20s, and Buckley's about 10 years older. And some of the elders of National Review were there, these famous figures, Frank Meyer and James Burnham and Wilmore Kendall, all these great mentors to Buckley. And they were up late one night before the wedding, and everyone is Catholic except Frank Meyer, who later converted, who's Jewish. And he says to them, so here I am with these brilliant Catholics. Tell me, have any one of you had a moment of doubt, where you question your faith? And they said, absolutely. And one after another says, absolutely, absolutely. What about you, Bill? Said, nope, not once. Well, what would happen, Bill, if you woke up in the middle of the night with this terrible anxiety about your faith? And Buckley said, I'd go back to sleep. He just never doubted. And that was so important to him. So I want to talk about a couple of things there, and then we'll get to questions. One is, that's how I understood, for those of you who are familiar with the story I tell, but the story of Buckley's life is, some of the news in the book was material I found in the Buckley's archive in their second home in Camden, South Carolina, which is for a number of years after the historic Brown decision in 1954, the Buckley family sponsored a segregationist newspaper, a white citizens council paper, for any of you who know what that means. It's kind of that, they're not the Klan, they're the local business people who don't want agitators in town. And the Buckleys agreed with them. At the same time that the Buckleys' generosity toward the black staff in their home and in the town was matchless. And I interviewed the one survivor from that period, man who became my friend, Edward Allen, whose father had been a gardener for the Buckleys. And Ed Allen had written letters to the archive after Bill Buckley died in 2008, saying what a wonderful man he'd been. And so I said to the archivist, he seems to be a black man, right? Do you think so? She said, yes, he is, and here's his phone number. So my wife and I went and talked to him, spent an hour with him, and you'll see it all in the book. And he said, the Buckleys changed the culture of Camden, South Carolina, because in the off season, they kept you on the payroll. Nobody else did that. So we can look at it and say, well, that's old style paternalism. Maybe, but nobody else was doing it, right? And if you were living hand to mouth, it made a difference. The other thing is, although the Buckleys then, and Bill Buckley for a number of years later, defended the South, by which he meant the white South, and its system of segregated schools, his father paid for the children. There were 11 Allen's siblings, and the ones who were admitted to college would be historically black colleges and universities in the South. Buckley's father paid their tuition. So it's in the context of his moment. I am not apologizing for anything. I'm just trying to explain how I think it worked. In the politics of his time, they were actually progressive. That's the progressive view of the white upper class in the South. It's not so different from the view you see in Harper Lee's books, right? Today we don't accept it, we don't get it, it doesn't make any sense to us. And I'll add one thing more to that. 13 years after writing quite a notorious editorial saying black Americans should not be allowed to vote in the South, defending the white position, 13 years after that, 1970, after he'd started his program, Firing Line, and interviewed people like the Black Panthers, which nobody else was doing, Muhammad Ali, and Jesse Jackson, he said, this country could use a black president. Young people I've talked to look at that and they read the essay. It was in Life magazine. They say, well, it kind of sounds condescending to me. And all I can say is it probably was, but you should see what other people were saying back then to understand it in context. That's really the challenge of writing a book like this. So now I want to come to the great moment that happened at Notre Dame, which some of you know about, and I believe one or two people may even have been here when he did it. 1978. It's the beginning of what was not yet called the Second Cold War. The term wasn't invented yet. And there were two people alive at that moment that I'm aware of who thought the Soviet Union could be defeated still. In the 1970s, Jimmy Carter is president. One of them is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a hero of Buckley's. And you'll see Buckley read Solzhenitsyn and drew on his reading in some of his spy novels, Blackford Oaks novels. The other guy was Bill Buckley, because Bill Buckley assumed he'd win everything he did, so why shouldn't he win the fight against communism too? That's why when it happened, he just kind of shrugged and was ready for the next battle. But he really spent his life conducting a campaign against communism in all fronts, in all phases. Well, in 1977, President Carter came here, gave a historic speech. You'll see it in Jonathan Alter's recent biography. It was here on this campus that Jimmy Carter said, we need a new foreign policy, a new worldview that's predicated on the idea of human rights all around the world, and let's not make a fetish of the communists. And it was a commencement speech, and Buckley was invited the next year. And he said, I disagree. He said, if we're going to talk about human rights, let's talk about human rights in the Soviet Union. And he went through a litany of the physicist Orlov, who'd been imprisoned without a trial. He went through the story of dissidents being suppressed. Remember in those days, those early days, Václav Havel and others behind the Iron Curtain starting to lead the protests. Buckley says, really, we don't care about them? He says, there was a famous Catholic who spoke here, his kind of alter ego, John F. Kennedy, and he quoted the famous lines from Kennedy's inaugural about carrying the torch, right, bearing any burden, being the force of light rather than darkness. And he looked out over this audience of Notre Dame students and he said, I know you don't want to hear this now, but I want you to think about that. He said, find a quiet grove, he said, and just walk through it and think about what it means to be a communist living in one of the satellite countries or the Soviet Union now. And people here know, some of the elders, it was not a well-received speech. There was some unhappiness about it. It sounded very bitter and angry, and he seemed to be denouncing the students. It's one of those pieces of writing, the really good pieces of oratory and writing that grow better over time. So when you read it today, it seems like a really eloquent plea because we know where the history was leading, that Buckley got it right. But Buckley feared, because it was happening in his own movement. So this is the late 1970s. So the big figure now who's emerged is Ronald Reagan, who had been Buckley's protege and disciple, who later betrayed him. But that's a story you have to read the book to see. And Buckley saw what a talent Reagan was. He'd seen it when he visited him in California, and when Buckley gave that Reagan gave the famous speech right before the 1964 election, where he stood behind the black curtain and made the famous speech for Barry Goldwater, which Reagan had wanted to do for weeks, and the Goldwater people wouldn't let him do it. Then finally let him make a speech, and he turns out to be a sensation, and that launched his political career, and Buckley's quietly pushing him the whole way. He was afraid that Reagan was going to be drafted into a third-party movement led by someone Buckley actually liked, and I will say as a friend of mine, I've interviewed him more than once. I wrote an article about him, Patrick Buchanan, who's actually kind of a charming, raffish guy if you ever meet him, like my other friend, Steve Bannon. I've done 5 hours on Steve Bannon's podcast. These guys are fun to talk to. I mean, what can I say? Well, Buchanan and others were building up a populist movement. Does anyone remember this? They wanted to do it in the late 1970s. Reagan was going to run on a ticket with George Wallace, the Alabama segregationist. They were pushing him. Pat Buchanan, Bill Rusher, the publisher of National Review, and Kevin Phillips, if you remember him. Kevin Phillips, who was kind of genius, wrote The Emerging Republican Majority and coined the term Sun Belt to describe the southern states. He, and southwestern states, they thought a Reagan-George Wallace ticket could win the election, and it just sent Buckley through the roof. He didn't like populism, and he didn't like that kind of appeal to people's baser instincts. Luckily, that doesn't happen in our politics today. We all feel good about that. But it was a concern back then. And so what Buckley wanted, and this is why it takes so long to write these books. I tell people, I'm not really that slow a writer, but I'm a really slow, dumb thinker. It takes me a long time to figure out what's going on. And I realize what's going on here is Buckley is making that speech to Ronald Reagan and the rest of the right. He comes to thee, and I do not want to be flippant or facetious about this. He's coming to the nearest thing the Vatican has the nearest thing the Catholic Church has to a Vatican in America is right here, right? I did the walk today. I went to the Basilica. I saw the Pietà. I went to the Grotto. I learned that there are chapels in every dorm room. Every dorm. And he wanted to come here to do that and tell his people on his side, the intellectuals, don't get seduced and go down this other path. So what does he do? He takes the greatest cause they have, which is anti-communism, the thing they all believe in. Every single one of them believes in it. It elevates them. It takes the discussion higher rather than lower, and it's about something really important, and goes before the public and makes this speech. Then he pairs it with another event that might seem unrelated until, again, you look at the context. He invites Reagan to join him in a big public debate on, see who remembers this, returning the Panama Canal through treaties to the Panamanians. And it had become the hottest issue on the right in America. Reagan, when he ran, challenged Gerald Ford in 1976, rescued his campaign by attacking the treaties, saying, we bought it, we owned it, it's ours, right? Famous lines. And Buckley's nervous about that. He's got strong ties to Latin America. If you wonder why Bill Buckley spoke in that complicated way with those big words, it's because English was his third language and he never stopped adding to his vocabulary. His first language was Spanish. So he knows the culture, and he thinks America, which has already suffered a humiliating defeat in Vietnam, 1975, is going to humiliate itself even worse if it really picks a fight with a tiny neighbor in its own hemisphere, while the communist China and communist Russia are dominating much of the globe. And he wants Reagan to understand that. And his fear, that Buckley was very brilliant strategically, he knew Reagan had to stay with the opposition to the canals through the primaries to get nominated by the Republicans. But he also knew if he stuck with that position too long, in the general election, it could really harm him. Because in those days, you had a more centrist, a larger group of centrist voters. So what he does is he wants to build some protection for Reagan. So what he does is challenge Reagan to a big public debate. And there are four on each side. Admiral McCain, the father of John McCain, was one of them, and John McCain was a war prisoner at that point. Buchanan was there, George Will, James Burnham. Some of the big lights in the intellectual right are there debating the Panama Canal. And Buckley's showing the world, this is who we are now. We can have Pat Buchanan make that argument, and George Will's going to counter him over here. We're going to have one admiral who's in favor of it and another admiral who's against it. And then Reagan and I will go head to head. So Buckley goes first. He gives this very eloquent literary address that flew over most people's heads, but he's a great talker. It's fun to listen to. Then Reagan comes on. And, Reagan is a much better debater, as people learned later, than they first thought he was. And Buckley knew he was a very good debater. Reagan in Hollywood was the best script reader of his time. What that meant was not that he could memorize it. He saw where the joke was in every line. And in those days, during World War II, Hollywood would make a movie in 2 or 3 weeks. So you had to master a script, and Reagan was the best at it. So Buckley knew he would do very well, and he can also improvise. And so this famous exchange, you can see it on YouTube. Reagan gets up there, and with that great aw shucks manner he had, said, "Well, Bill, what I want to know is why haven't you, after he's spoken, why don't you come over here and say you've seen the light?" And everybody laughs. And then Buckley says, and I wish I could do his voice, which I can't. I can do the words though. He says, "Well, I'm afraid that you'd be blinded by the force of my argument." And he gets a bigger laugh. And the liberal columnist, Mary McGrory, in the Washington Post, the next day or a couple days later, said, "Forget the Senate debate on Panama. You don't need to listen to it. Watch Reagan and Buckley. Just listen to them do it." And at that moment, what he did was he had enough confidence in Reagan and knew him well enough to know he would be the fall guy for Reagan. He would go out there and be the smart guy that Reagan gets the better of and do it in a public way. And the combination of that, plus the great oration here, redirected, in my belief, the Republican Party away from what was going to be a kind of, in those days they called backlash, populist politics, toward this higher ground of the global crusade against communism. And it worked. And that's why a lot of what came afterwards for Buckley was almost a denouement, because that was his great moment. So those are my remarks here. Do we have questions? Or I know I kind of talk everybody into silence. So let's just get right to it. Yes, sir.
We have a few minutes for questions. There'll be some refreshments, and you can talk with Sam.
Okay.
As well,
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mr. Tanenhaus. The question I want to ask is about Buckley's views on foreign policy. From the top? Thanks. I have a question about Buckley's views on foreign policy, specifically regarding Franco's Spain. Do we have a sense of, given the formation given by his mother and the sympathetic view towards some swaths of Catholic America towards Franco's Spain, whether or not Buckley had a pro or moderate or entertaining view of Franco's regime?
Yeah, great question. And that combination of answers you gave, those possibilities are the answer. Yes, they were pro-Franco. Early on when he was raised in the 1930s, they were definitely supported Franco the way so many American Catholics did. Then Buckley, with his magnificent Spanish, toured Spain in 1957. And there he saw what some of the problems were. He still believed, it's the argument Gene Kirkpatrick was later to make, famous argument, Commentary Magazine, that better to have this autocrat than another one, but he knew he was an autocrat and knew it wouldn't last. He was kinder to him than he should have been. And I don't think he ever really acknowledged the extent of the bad stuff that had happened in Spain. What complicated it was his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, moved to Spain and lived there for a while. And I didn't mention, I feel bad, I meant to talk about Brent Bozell when I came here. I've been partly programmed by my wife, who told me when I started making presentations, do not go out and say the true founder of the modern right is Brent Bozell and not Bill Buckley, even though that's probably true. Gary Wills was a Catholic on the left. Brent Bozell was a Catholic on the right, who surrounded Buckley. He was part of Buckley's genius. Bozell converted to Catholicism right before he got to Yale. He was the big pro-Franco guy. And that's where you would see the writings in National Review. He moved to Spain. There was a philosopher they admired, Frederick Wilhelmsen, who lived in Spain and was pro-Spain, pro-Franco. And so there was a fair amount of that National Review. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that was mainly through that in the Cold War period when we were officially supporting them too.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanenhaus. My question concerns Buckley's view of the Vatican II reforms. Given Catholicism was such a huge influence on his life, on the one hand, I would expect that he would be appreciative of the move towards religious liberty in almost an Americanizing sense. On the other hand, I have a hard time seeing Buckley getting on board with the anti-traditionalist urges of, say, the spirit of Vatican II. So what was his general view of the council?
Buckley found churches where he could do the Latin Mass. Remember, because they put it in the Vulgate, he wouldn't do it. He was not a fan of it. He was not as aggressively opposed to it as some others were. Just as it's surprising if you read Buckley on the later encyclicals, the one on contraception, Humanae Vitae. Buckley was agreed with it, but he also accepted the liberal arguments, which they seem absurd today, but the fear, for those of you who remember or have dug around in this, was that there was a book called The Population Bomb that said the country was going to be overpopulated. Overpopulation was a concern, so they wanted Catholics to stop having children. Buckley's answer was, well, let's have the Protestants have fewer children. The Protestants and the Jews and the Buckleys and the Catholics can keep having them. He was, after that first conflict with Roncalli, with John the 23rd, Buckley was never as aggressively anti-Vatican. He was really burned by that. And there's a remark he made when someone questioned him about that in 61, they were really offended by it. And Buckley said, if my conservatism ever comes in conflict with my Catholicism, the conservatism goes. Catholicism is first. So I think he kind of reconciled himself to that too. But what he would do is he'd find different voices to make the argument. So Wills, for instance, was much more open, Gary Wills, to Vatican II. And Brent Bozell was on the warpath. And that's what moved him to the right. We started his magazine Triumph, which was very much a kind of throne and altar, integralist publication, really ahead of its time in that way. I didn't get to interview Bozell. He died, although I did speak with his wife and one of his sons.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I listened to the book as soon as it came out, but I'm just trying to refresh my memory now. So one of the things that struck me is it seemed that his father's kind of political views really influenced Buckley. So his mother influenced him in being a pious Catholic, but his father really influenced his political views. And it seems that that kind of aligned with the America First kind of movement of the early 20th century. And so I'm wondering if there's kind of, if you can draw somewhat of a straight line from some of the political orientation he picks up from his father to the present.
Yeah, there's certainly a connection. I don't know if it's a straight line, but there's a line you can follow. I found Buckley's very first speech, which he made at the age of 15 in his prep school, Millbrook in Dutchess County, New York. It was a defense of Charles Lindbergh. It's absolutely brilliant. Just as a piece of rhetoric. That's when he discovered he had a talent for doing this. What he wanted to be, by the way, there were two things he dreamed of being when he was young. Either a priest or a pianist. And he wasn't cut out to be either one of them. So he found this other métier instead. One reason he mocked himself and his talents, didn't take himself too seriously, was he'd been humbled by the things he wasn't able to do, which is a good thing for anyone to learn. The father was very much an old-style, late 19th century, kind of McKinley era conservative. His own idols were, Andrew Carnegie, right? Henry Ford, the great tycoons who made fortunes, changed the world. He was an oil speculator. He was a lawyer. He was a brilliant lawyer. Apparently had a mind as quick as Buckley's. If you ever encountered Buckley in person, it was just shocking how quickly he would come back at you with whatever he said. You can see some of it in Firing Line. He had that drawl, so it doesn't sound so fast. But if you're in the room with him, he's got your head spinning right away. That all came from the father. The father was multilingual like Buckley. He prized literary intellectuals above all other people. There's a great line in one of his letters I quote in the book. After God, Man at Yale, when Buckley looked like he's become a success, and then after his book about Joe McCarthy, which was all controversial but a bestseller, his father wanted him to go to Oxford and do graduate work in English. And his father said, there isn't a single politician in America who's got an education. So a decent education. You could be the first one. And he says, they're all socialists over there, but so what? They'll teach you the stuff you need to know. Go to Germany or go to England and do this. And Buckley was a journalist. He just didn't have the patience to do what you need to do to be a scholar. But the ideas didn't really vary that much. Where he broke with the father, and all the siblings did, was on anti-Semitism. The father was really quite an intense anti-Semite, and no one knew where it came from. Because when I dug into the family, I saw that one of Buckley's aunts had actually been, who was a scholar of Spanish mission churches, quite an accomplished historian, had also belonged to interfaith brotherhood organizations. In those days, it was the early 1900s, 1920s, meant Jews and Catholics. So I don't know where the father's animus came from. He connected them with Bolsheviks, which a lot of people did in those days. But that was one place where Bill Buckley broke with the father, and the siblings did too. There was none of them who was virulently anti-Semitic. And Buckley once said that the closest thing to the ideal person, to an ideal Christian he ever met, was his friend at Time magazine, Richard Clerman, who was Jewish. Do you want to get something?
Maybe one question, if not, you know what, okay, Tom, last question, and then we'll go to refreshments and book signing.
Thanks very much. Your comments about his devotional Catholicism really struck me, and it's in the book as well. Another devotional Catholic who took the Eucharist very seriously and was a big figure in Catholic culture on the margins, but also big, was Dorothy Day. And I'm wondering, did he ever think about the way in which she was a Catholic, devout, the Eucharist central to her life, and how that, in a way, matched him, and then in another way, it's completely.
Yeah, he should have been a lot kinder to Dorothy Day than he was. I mean, it was not, in person he was always kind. But when he had a famous series of debates with a guy named Bill Clancy, Commonwealth magazine, those are the ones that Gary Wills tutored Buckley for. He was pretty tough on Dorothy Day. And he said she's a wonderful woman with a disordered mind. That she couldn't think through the ideas rationally. And others in his own circle thought much more highly of her, like Wills, for instance. And Buckley had an on-again, off-again friendship with the great cultural journalist, not a Catholic, Dwight MacDonald. And MacDonald wrote a series of profiles of Dorothy Day, thought she was a kind of saint. And I think Buckley came around on a lot of those opinions earlier. You have to remember the young, very contentious Buckley is in his 20s or early 30s when he's doing much of this, and getting called names every time he goes on stage. So he's got to be aggressive toward anyone he thought was on the left. She was too far left for him. But he did know how devout she was and how true a Catholic. I was at lunch, I know we have to stop here in a second, but I think it's worth repeating. I never heard Buckley say, and I never read, where he suggested someone was a Catholic was a bad Catholic. Like, for instance, Dorothy Day says she's a wonderful person, she's a wonderful member of the church. I disagree with everything she says. And that's a difference, I feel, with some of the debate today. When Buckley had his most intense agreement with Gary Wills, he said, because Wills had turned so much against the church that people didn't even understand why he called himself a Catholic, but he had his own reasons. And the harshest thing Buckley said is, I wish Gary Wills would leave the church. If he hates it so much, he ought to leave it. But he never said he doesn't have the right, that it diminishes him as a Catholic. So the language was very important to him. And then Wills, you probably know this, finally did leave the church a couple of years ago. Okay?
Thank you. So,
thank everyone. So patient.
And refreshments, Sam will be around to talk. Let's give Sam Tanenhaus
Watch it. I promise I would